Good afternoon. I'm delighted to see such a large and diverse audience. It's an audience that comprises academics and lay publics, artists and practitioners and policymakers. So a very varied audience. You're very welcome here. My name is Robin Williams, and I'm the director of the Institute for the Study of Science, Technology and Innovation at the University of Edinburgh. And I'm delighted to have been invited to welcome you to the final event for this project called the Framework for Responsible Research and Innovation in Information and Communication Technologies. Now, in 1933, there was a World Fair in Chicago that had science and technology as its theme. And the official motto of the World Fair was "A century of progress. Science finds, industry applies, and man conforms." That was the conference motto. Now, today that model of innovation is seen as deeply inadequate, dated, and flawed, not just in the sexism of its terminology, but in the conception it offered of the relationship between humanity and technology. So today we find new forms of expertise. For example, Marina Jirotka here, who's an associate professor in computer science from Oxford University, who led the project that we're going to hear about shortly. Now, Marina specializes in requirements engineering and understanding how ICT design might better meet the needs of the people that use it. But how can we ensure that the technologies are developed in a way that meets an escalating range of social concerns, not just the needs of its sponsors, but also, for example, concerns about environmental sustainability, or concerns about the privacy and informational integrity of diverse stakeholders. And these are not just users and the people who buy technology, but others who are affected and implicated by the existence of big data and data systems. The other question then is, can we attend to these issues of social acceptability and social demands? Can we attend to these from the outset when we're building and planning technologies, rather than, as so often seems to be the case, learning about them with painfully acquired hindsight? So the question that we're being invited to address by Marina and her colleagues is the unresolved question: how do we innovate responsibly in a digital world? Now, Marina will shortly be giving us an introduction to the Framework for Responsible Research and Innovation project and how it's grappled with these questions. But this is the opening act of a packed agenda, and there's an impressive lineup of contributors who are going to approach the topic from different perspectives. And I'd like to briefly run through the agenda for the day. Our keynote is going to be from Sir Nigel Shadbolt from the University of Southampton. He is, amongst many other things, chairman and co-founder of the Open Data Institute. And in this role, he's become a figurehead for thinking about the power of data and how access to this data and its benefits might be opened up. And Bernd Carstenstahl, who's a co-investigator on the Responsible Innovation Project from De Montfort University, will be in the chair. We then break for coffee, where you're invited to engage with the artistic display that Barbara Garajska has put together. And Barbara Garajska is the artist in residence for this project. And her work is on display there, and some of her colleagues will be doing a short performance. Next, we have a panel discussion, which will be chaired by Lizzie Coles-Kemp from Royal Holloway. I presume that's the University of London rather than the Penal Institution. But we're delighted to be able to put together a range of different perspectives. And these are going to encompass, for example, a non-governmental organisation. So we welcome Daniel Stauffacher, who's the founder and president of the ICT for Peace Foundation. We welcome an academic digital innovator, Derek Macaulay, known as Mac to his friends, who leads the Horizon Institute at the University of Nottingham. We next welcome a sponsor of research and a funder of much academic research in the ICT area, John Hand from EPSRC, that's the Economic and Physical Science Research Council. Now, John used to run the Digital Economy Programme and now runs EPSRC's Impact Programme, so very well equipped to address these things. Then we have an industrial player. What industrial player would you want for a topic like this? Google would seem to be a suitable candidate. So we're delighted to welcome Anthony House, who leads Google's European Public Policy Analysis and Strategy team. And last but not least, can we welcome Judy Wiseman from the London School of Economics, whose work has focused on the technology-society relationship, and in particular on the relationship between technology and gender. So we're going to have these panel sessions, and we're going to move from that into a question and answer session, which will be chaired by Tristan Riley-Smith. Then finally, Tristan Riley-Smith will be presenting the final wrap-up. Now, Tristan is from the Centre for Science and Policy at the University of Cambridge, and he's external champion to the RC UK Global Uncertainties Programme. So, huge agenda. When you get to the end of it, you're going to feel overwhelmed, but we hope you will stay a little longer to engage with the artistic displays and the artists you'll be seeing around, and for a drinks reception. So we hope you'll stay on until 6 o'clock. We've got a packed schedule. I think we should get underway. But could we now welcome Marina Jirotka, who's going to set the scope for this study. Thank you, Marina.
Thank you, Robin. So, what I'm going to talk to you today about is I'm going to give you a very brief introduction of what responsible research and innovation is and some of the key issues and challenges. I'll also briefly go through some of the ways that we've gone about addressing some of those challenges on our project, a framework for responsible research and innovation, or RRI, and information and communication technologies, ICT. So we all know, or we think we know, that the advances in ICTs have made our lives better in so many ways. For example, through technology we can communicate more easily and so better maintain relationships with remote family members. We can access knowledge and new ways to learn. We can more easily mobilize political campaigns, and we can apply collective pressure on politicians and corporations, and we can benefit from an almost unlimited access to culture and entertainment. But there are dark sides too. For example, the anonymity that allows us to explore the internet can also be a cover for abusive activity, such as cyberbullying, leaving victims distraught and sometimes driving them to suicide. In such cases, where do these responsibilities lie? Cyberbullying reconfigures the conventional responsibilities of parents, schools, online platforms, legislators and innovators, compelling them to actually consider and almost adopt new roles and new duties of care. Broadly speaking, it's clear that ICT brings great benefits and opportunities, and at the same time, it can have very negative consequences. The benefits can make us exhilarated about the continual novelty of technology and new possibilities, but it can also leave us uneasy that we're being swept away into new ways of living with implications that we don't fully understand and with consequences that we feel we cannot control. So at this point, I'd like to show you a very short film which in a light way will introduce you to some of the issues responsible innovation grapples with. The film draws on one example of a new technology, affective computing, and talks about it in relation to responsible research and innovation. It could be any kind of technology we choose here, but we've chosen this one for your entertainment.
The Framework for Responsible Research and Innovation in ICT Project, FRRIICT. Imagine interacting with your very own robot. You're preparing breakfast in the kitchen one morning, and in comes the robot. "Good morning," it says with a smile. "Morning," you say grumpily. It looks at your face, tunes into the tone of your voice, notices smoke rising above the stove, and hears you slam a pot into the sink. Quickly, the robot works out that you are not having a good morning at all. Because this robot is an emotionally aware robot, it can change its behavior according to what it notices about you. It can guess your mood from your posture, your tone of voice, the color of your face, your heart rate or breathing pattern. The information helps it interact with you in a more natural way. So if you're having a bad morning, it can avoid upsetting you further and can even try to make you feel better. This kind of robot is an example of an effective device. Effective devices are designed to perceive, interpret, or express emotions like we humans do. But while there are benefits to this kind of technology, there are serious considerations too. Like, where does the robot store your emotional profile? And who has access to it? Insurance companies? Drug companies? Future employers? And what if the robot becomes so good at expressing and responding to human emotions that it confuses people? What if people begin to treat the robot like it's a fellow person? And how would we feel if these systems misinterpreted our behaviors? Would we feel deceived? How would this affect our sense of control over the technologies that play a part in our daily lives? Our work explores how we can make innovations in digital technologies that are mindful of the consequences for individuals and society. To do this, designers of technology should make their best efforts to anticipate the consequences of their innovations, reflect upon the problem they're trying to solve, engage with all those who have an interest or are affected by the innovation, and act to ensure the innovation is socially desirable. By studying the positive and negative impacts of computing devices and factoring them into the design process for future innovations, research communities become more accountable both to those that fund their work and to the public in general.
So, responsible research and innovation has emerged really in response to a world where many of the risks, the uncertainties and the challenges that we face stem from our own human activities, where things like global warming, population pressure, the financial crisis all have a significant global impact. We're more aware now that science and technology increasingly are able to manipulate the very physical, biological and social fabrics of our world through things like synthetic biology, the design and development of new biological systems, or through nanotechnology, the manipulation of very small things on an atomic or a molecular scale. These innovations can provide powerful new solutions to existing societal challenges, but they also bring with them new and potentially even more potent dangers. So it is in recognizing that as innovations become more novel and powerful, that we have to take even greater care in understanding the full spectrum of implications of their use. This is the task of FRRIICT. And it's not confined to ICTs. It emerged from debates in nanotechnology and is now being promoted across many areas of research. But ICTs do have some features that raise particular concerns for responsibility, which we'll look at later. So responsible innovation is about understanding who has what responsibility and who has the capacity to discharge those responsibilities. But there are various challenges to making such a thing work in practice. For example, how do we make decisions about technologies without knowing beforehand what the implications will be? And how can we embed this? How can we embed FRRIICT as a source of creativity into the innovation process? Who gets to decide what technological features are more or less desirable? And how do we decide who should be accountable and when? And when does this take place, as researchers are often not in control over the practical applications of their work when they're taken up by industry or by commercialized into products or services? So the goal of our project was really to examine how we could do this. How could we embed FRRIICT into UK ICT research practices and products? To do that, we actually began by interviewing computer scientists, policymakers, civil society members, and a set of other stakeholders to get their understanding of what FRRIICT might look like within the practical context of ICT research. And from these interviews, we identified certain features of these technologies which, taken in combination, make it unique to other forms of science. And I'm going to list just a few here. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, is the speed of innovation. Traditional distinctions between research, innovation and diffusion lose their relevance in ICT. For example, the rhythm of ICT is such that you can develop an app today and it can go viral within a matter of hours without any kind of assessment or oversight and have certain kinds of societal implications. Second, a thing called logical malleability. Technologies can be used in any number of different ways, in a wide variety of applications, making the possible uses and misuses of ICTs particularly difficult to predict. And that situation is complicated even further as new devices get interlinked with existing devices in unpredicted ways. Third, ICT is pervasive. It affects most aspects of life and is almost impossible to bypass within individual homes, organizations, the economy, or society. Fourthly, we have embedded algorithms. Increasingly, the behavior of many physical things which we interact with, such as, for example, engine management systems in cars, is governed by algorithms, the step-by-step procedures for calculations in computers. While such systems can actually improve energy efficiency or engine efficiency and performance, they can also make the behavior of systems much harder to understand and harder for end users to configure. So we might ask ourselves, what might our experience of the world be like if companies were then able to choose the route that we take in driverless cars? Another aspect of this pervasiveness is the way that these algorithms are actually brought into our more personal moments through wearable and mobile technologies, and how they come to mediate our most intimate social interactions, as well as underpinning a profiling industry that silently shapes our experiences and opportunities. And finally, for the ICT features, we have the problem of many hands. Most technical activities in organizations are split up between many individuals. This makes drawing a clear line between individual actions and eventual consequences very difficult to draw. So, taking these things into account and building on an existing framework that was developed by Jack Stilgoe, Richard Owen and Phil McNaughton, we shaped an RRI framework specifically for ICT. As we showed in the short film, a simple way for people to think about the issues is through a mnemonic, the AREA framework. This framework invites people involved in research and innovation to A, anticipate the possible impacts and outcomes of their work, R, reflect on its purposes and implications, E, engage with other stakeholders about these topics, and A, then to act accordingly, take some action with all that knowledge. This mnemonic area acts as guiding principles for researchers and other stakeholders to get them to reflect on the process and the product of their innovations. From our discussions then with a very wide variety of people, we have shaped the AREA framework to have a focus on research process, product, purpose and people, the 4 Ps, all of which play an important role when you're considering questions of responsibility for ICT. And we've also included, as you'll see, a focus on what makes the ICT features unique. We suggest that for each of these 4 Ps, and at various stages of ICT development, researchers can ask themselves different questions to guide them through the process of considering these RRI issues. We've put those questions into the form of a table, which highlights really that RRI is much more a matter of discussion and experimentation rather than a formula to be prescribed. So how might it work? Well, if we take our effective robot example, and here we see Pepper, a Japanese care robot that can read human emotions, there's been much in the media over the last few weeks. So from our scenario in the film, the robot detects our emotions and is able to react in an effective manner. For example, by trying to cheer us up if we're grumpy in the morning. A researcher developer might look to those questions early on in the development process. And here one question might be if the innovation is actually socially desirable, envisaging then what certain consequences might be. So some considerations that might be raised here, issues of trust, compete then with better interaction with the robot. The interaction may seem more natural and give a richer experience, but there may be feelings of being deceived or of being manipulated. And in a care environment, what implications does that have for our cultural sense of duty of care, compassion, and value of companionship. We only have to think about what Facebook may have done to this concept of friend. In terms of ICT and the features of ICT, we might consider the pervasiveness or ubiquity of ICT. And then you might think, well, I then, as a researcher in the field of robotics, I might ask myself if these considerations actually affect me. I just do research in the lab, focusing on performance, how far my robot arm can actually throw a ball. This then versus the fact that pretty soon certain outcomes of my research will hit the market, the Japanese pepper robot, for example. How can I and why should I have responsibility for what other people do when they make it into a product? So the framework questions are that they're designed for researchers and innovators to draw on at all points of innovation, from early upstream activities where the innovations are conceived to more downstream activities where they're actually turned into products. But we've also understood that many of those people involved in ICT research and innovation are not experts in RRI or are unfamiliar with having to deal with those types of questions. They might not have the skills and tools to explore the possible consequences of ICT. They might not want to engage with the public or find out where an innovation would be desirable or acceptable. Innovating responsibly isn't something that one individual can easily achieve. It requires a community. It requires support from companies, regulators, civil society, users, funders, and other people. The success of responsible research and innovation really depends on support from the development of such a community and access to shared resources and good practice. So to try and achieve that, we've also created an observatory for RRI and ICT. This is a community resource where people have contributed content related to responsible innovation. It contains case studies, descriptions of technology, possible solutions, and more. And the aim is to bring together that community of ICT researchers and innovators who are interested in undertaking their work in a much more reflexive and inclusive way. Reflexive in that researchers can begin to think ahead to the potential consequences of their work, and inclusive in that a much wider group of stakeholders can actually participate in the process of innovation. So what of the future for RRI? Well, partly we hope that will be discussed this afternoon and then beyond after the event. We all know that there are significant challenges to embedding RRI into the development process, both in research and industry. But the signs are generally promising. The European Union has a budget of 70 billion euros for its next research funding tranche called Horizon 2020. They've allocated a budget of 450 million euros for RRI, requiring it to be a cross-cutting activity for proposals submitted to their Science with and for Society programme. And even more recently, people are researching into new types of technology called quantum technologies. The Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council currently has a call out for proposals for quantum technology hubs, with a significant budget allocated to address the challenges of developing quantum science through technology to application. The call asks researchers to engage deeply with RRI throughout the research to technology life cycle, and as such is a demonstration of the research sponsor's commitment. It also raises further challenges for the new technology and what it means to innovate responsibly. So we've developed a potential framework then to enable people to think about some of those societal issues and challenges of new technologies. We've also raised a series of questions on how we might innovate responsibly, the types of questions that we hope we'll discuss this afternoon. And I want to end by saying that despite the many challenges of making RRI work in our innovation processes, it really should be viewed as an opportunity rather than a burden. An opportunity to align the values of ICT researchers with the values of the wider public as a source of creativity towards identifying new kinds of research challenges that might be socially beneficial. I'd just like to, at this point, to thank our partners on the project. The partners are the Horizon, Rural and Sci Digital Economy. They supported this event quite strongly. And to our sponsors, the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. I also want to show you the members of our team who are floating around in the audience. So should anybody wish to talk to them about RRI or discuss something more informally, please feel free to do so. So thank you very much. I'm going to take questions because we're kind of packed a lot into a small space. Any questions that you have for me will happen at the question-answer session after the panel, if that's okay. And at this point, I'd like to ask Bernd Stahl to come up to introduce Nigel Shadbolt.
Okay, as you've just heard from Marina, research and innovation in ICT covers a large array of activities, of technologies, of applications, of algorithms. So we've seen the examples ranging from effective robots to quantum information technology. What many, maybe most, maybe all of those different technologies and applications have in common is that they produce new types of data and new quantities of data. That's given rise to the phenomenon that we often call big data, or possibly better, ubiquitous data. And this big data is going to be one of the key challenges of responsible innovation in ICT. I'm therefore delighted to be able to introduce Professor Sir Nigel Shadbolt as our keynote speaker today. Nigel has an academic history and academic background in philosophy, psychology, and linguistics, and has used that in order to be able to be active in the area of artificial intelligence. Nigel is currently Professor of Artificial Intelligence at the University of Southampton, where he also heads the Web and Internet Science group. He also does lots of other things. He has an enormous number of awards to his name. He is the director or the chairman and co-founder of the Open Data Institute, and he's worked intensively with the UK government, specifically, or you may be aware of the activities in the area of data.gov.uk, where the UK government is trying to make publicly owned data available. So Nigel clearly is an expert in this field, but he's also had a long-standing interest in the question of how humans use computing and technology in order to address the big challenges we face. So I think I can say that he's uniquely qualified to talk about big data, ubiquitous data, specifically with regards and in the framework of the question of responsible innovation in ICT. So, without further ado, I want to hand over to Professor Sir Nigel Shadbolt.
For those of you who are aware that although we live in a world of ubiquitous data, we do not live in a world of seamless interoperability, and that actually is one of the challenges we face. So it's a real delight to talk at this event. When Marina asked me some months ago, I felt compelled to accept because it's a really important set of questions around responsible innovation in this space. In fact, she's already touched upon some of the issues I want to address. I'm going to speak for about 35 minutes and then take questions. She's talked about a number of issues. One of them, of course, is the whole notion of technical trends. There are any number of laws. In fact, if you want to get ahead in ICT generally, try and find something that's doubling about every 15 months and give it a name, okay? Usually after yourself, and you've got a trick there. Moore's law, which many of you know, is the reference to the density of originally transistors on square areas of silicon or square areas of compute board. That's been doubling about every 15 months for a very long time. That density of processing power means that since I started working AI until now, we've had a 1 million-fold increase in computing power. 1 million. Very, very few disciplines are truly exponential in their rates of change. ICT is. And it's not just in processing power, storage capacity, sometimes called Kreider's law, pretty well the same. Every 10.3 years, 1,000-fold increase in the ability to store the same amount of data on a square area. Now that has some remarkable consequences. It's remarkable consequences in terms of the devices you're carrying around, the fact you can store huge amounts of your own personal photography and other information on a device you carry around. It means that in a few years' time, literally, you will be able to lifelog your entire life to a laptop device of the future. all your awake experience, 70 plus years of it, recorded in excruciating detail, live, forever. That's the level of storage that's becoming routinely available. And this will introduce, along with those capacities, challenges. Nielsen's law has to do with connection speeds. There are many. The other thing we're seeing is this perfect storm of what we call device engineering. Very small scale, very capable sensors. This means that the much heralded Internet of Things is happening, it is around us, it will be very significant. We will have sensors everywhere, from our blood pressure to our blood sugar levels, to our respiratory rates, to our walking, how ambulatory we are we fit, are we unfit, have we actually been to the pub today? You cannot believe the amount of incidental data that you are throwing out all the time as you walk through the world. And the devices formerly known as a mobile phone are busy logging more and more of that in exquisite detail. There are challenges there. And not just the sensors will be everywhere, everyone will be a sensor. Okay? And this has some interesting consequences because it won't be just about surveillance, it'll be about this new class of valence, surveillance. The fact that because everybody else is recording incidentally information about their environment, you will be caught in many of those recordings by other people. So there'll be a pervasive capability to assemble information together. And as we know, our data is everywhere. This is the, if you like, the databases the state currently hold about us in this country, literally from cradle to grave. There are a lot of them. Fortunately, there isn't one big one, but there are many of them. And one interesting question is whether we should have more routine access to the data on those data sites. But it's not just the government and public sector, it is, of course, the private sector. More and more about us everywhere. And as a result of this ubiquity of data, we have celebrated examples. A well-known one is Target, the US supermarket, which knows so much about you, the buyer in the US, that about 20 products is sufficient to predict whether a customer is pregnant and their due date. Okay? And of course, when they start bombarding households with literature related to those products, it may come as a surprise to some members of that household. So we already throw off real challenges in an unanticipated way from the capability we have. The issue is, how far do we go with this consumer-targeted big data analysis? Other analysis we know, academic research, perfectly respectable, well-conceived, well-motivated, shows the extent to which our routine interactions at web scale with these new applications classifies us, identifies us, signifies us. So this is work from Cambridge University Psychometric Center. They looked at 58,000 people's likes on Facebook. Okay? And they were able to do this. This was a consented piece of research. They were able to do this, but what they could find was that depending on the network of likes, they could do essentially network analysis and reveal with 65 to 73% accuracy issues about relationship status, whether you were implicated in substance abuse, your political leanings, perhaps unsurprisingly, 85% accurate, your religious disposition, 82%, your particular male sexual orientation to 88% accuracy. This has been a result well known. Studies at MIT too have revealed the fact that your like relationships to other individuals in your social network are not simply happenstance. They say and tell something about your interests. Ethnicity, 95% accuracy. So the interesting thing about that, these observations alone are roughly as informative as traditional individual psychometric testing to make some of these predictions. So we are in a world in which our behavior at scale starts to reveal really powerful features about us. Now, we could get very gloomy at this point and think the game's up, and this is all going to be an Orwellian future we're facing. And of course, the whole issue of this afternoon's debate is to understand why that need not, should not, and will not be the case, but we must take care, we must be prudent. And the reason I am fundamentally optimistic is that at the heart of many of our infrastructures, what we're trying to do, the Science Museum is a great testament to this, to see kids running around, the objects and artifacts that were there to improve a human's lot, to actually help our society be more effective. Niels Bohr, the developer of quantum theory, last year was the centenary of the publication of 4 key papers in quantum theory. And actually, he was a man who embodied really profound values around the issue of what we do in the face of these challenges, particularly the proliferation and rates of change in science. His view was a very simple and disarming one: openness. He wrote a letter in the late 50s to world leaders actually suggesting that nuclear weapons secrets should simply be made openly available. Everyone should have them, because that would essentially stabilize proliferation. And in fact, in some sense, mutually assured destruction was the terrifying balancing out of the fact that knowledge was held to an equivalent status by state agents, and there was no way they could rescind that information, but neither could they assume superiority by having it and another superpower not having it. His view was that that should be the routine position. Now, whether we agree with that or not, here's another interesting proponent of openness. This is Tim Berners-Lee's injunction that the web must remain open and accessible. Because actually keeping the web free and open is essential to an open and fair democracy. To have the kind of discussions we're going to have today at scale requires an open web. And we can give you lots of examples of the web at scale being an extraordinary tool for empowerment. One of my favorite is the system Ushahidi. This was built in about a week flat by open source developers. It was a response to the Kenyan elections, the riots of 2007. They got together and realized that in Africa, in Kenya, there was no connected 3G, 4G network, but lots of people had mobile phones, they had SMS, they could take a photograph. What they began to do was build a system that would allow people to contribute essentially situational awareness to an rapidly unfolding situation. And the wonderful slogan here, which is a kind of a motif for many of the efforts that unlock the creative power of individuals, is no one knows everything, everybody knows something. Okay. What does that do at scale? Well, in the case of Ushahidi and the Kenyan riots, people were taking photos, posting SMSs, and then the web was being used to integrate that information, geolocate it, and the world's attention was brought to that issue. Extraordinarily powerful, and it was one of the main reasons why people believe that the actual problem was so quickly addressed and had to be managed, couldn't be denied by people there. That platform, interestingly, has been repurposed in many contexts. It's a powerful way to recruit information fast. And so it's been used in Fukushima, it's been used in the Washington snow out, it's been used in many, many contexts, the Gaza incursion and so on. And in fact, one of the things that we have been doing in my own research group at Southampton is trying to understand how these systems work at scale. We have a project actually funded by EPSRC called The Theory and Practice of Social Machines. And it's this observation, which is that in the world in which we live, most of our interactions are social ones. And again, a promise that Tim Berners-Lee saw for the web was that the machines could do the boring, tedious, administrative stuff, and humans would do the creative work. That was the vision. And that we might see the evolution of a whole new form of social interaction. I'll talk a little bit about that. The irony is that actually that balance hasn't necessarily been true. And if we look at things like Mechanical Turk, people are being put to work at web scale to do very, very routine work for very, very small amounts of remuneration. And so, what had appeared to be a very emancipating model, doesn't always stay the way you think. What we're trying to understand in our definition of this is that we've got new kinds of assemblies of systems that aren't just computational. They're about social engagement. They're about coordination of engagement at scale. And they're about sharing communication at web scale. And the challenge, again, for technologists, policymakers, people interested in responsible research and innovation is the space that we're exploring is very different than where traditional innovation has happened. It's everywhere. It's decentralized. So effectively, if we look at the world in terms of where things are happening in compute terms and how much social interaction there is, we're starting to see increasingly a need to understand social computation, which is decentralized through society. How do we even account for that? But what we do believe, it will be a lot about actual democratic empowerment. I haven't got time, and it's not my intention to talk more on that project, but it is an interesting response to try and understand how things are changing with these new types of large-scale assembly of people. I'll come back to that a little while. Now, unsurprisingly, the web with all its open values is not a place where good things always happen, okay? So the jihadists use it to promulgate their message and recruit and coordinate their efforts. And the other thing that we must recognize is those exponents are fast, but they are particularly fast at times of conflict. So science and technology, fast though it is, often really accelerates in particular areas when there is actually recognized external threats and conflicts. And whether that is the bomb, the first machines developed at Bletchley, or Colossus, the first semi-digital computers that were cracking German high command codes, or of course the Manhattan Project, these systems actually are a result of coordinated large-scale effort. So at times of conflict, S&T can accelerate, and that's led very obviously in the area that I've worked at in AI to examples of pilotless aircraft, drones, okay, autonomous vehicles, satellite observation and collection of data at levels which we would have really struggled to envisage a couple of decades ago. We knew the work was ongoing, but it was still very much in the lab. And so, you know, a real issue, an ethics issue that a professor of AI at Sheffield, Noel Sharkey, struggles with is, should we be already thinking about banning or having some non-proliferation treaty in areas of AI-controlled or autonomous weapons platforms? And there's a perfect example of where the issue is, we didn't think we'd be having to plug in Asimov's robotics laws of robotics into devices in 2014, but it may be a real and material consideration. Of course, insight on the web, how it works, is also important to understand where the bad things and how the bad things do happen. One of my PhD students, Michael Yip, has been looking at carding forums. These are the places where criminals and organized crime goes to trade your credit cards and rip off your identity for very, very small amounts of individual value, by the way. But understanding how they're organized, how they use the web. The interesting thing is that many of the values that we see in the collaborative web we understand and applaud are just the same in these closed networks. Trust is essential. Your credentials to be an effective member of these forums are essential. Keeping the bad guys out, who in this case are law enforcement officers, is essential. And so trying to understand how you can use that insight against these groups. Can you destabilize trust? Can you look at how the networks emerge and sow the seeds of doubt, so to say, becomes an active research area. And again, asking yourself what the limits on these defensive capabilities are at web scale is a material question. So I want to revert back now for the rest of my talk on this theme of openness at web scale and data at web scale. So the web is open because of some fundamental design decisions. It's universal in the sense that the protocols, these things, the hypertext markup language, URIs, the hypertext transfer protocol, they are open, royalty-free for everyone to use. That was a really important design decision. Somewhat decentralized. Some would argue not as decentralized as it could be, but the web is nevertheless not run out of one organization, not run out of one set of routers. That net neutrality, the fact you don't legislate against particular kinds of content over others, is an assumed value. That open standards are preferred and used. That it's an open platform that will run across your mobile phone as well as your laptop. A number of years ago, people were claiming that the web would die because people weren't using web protocols to build apps on their mobile phones. Actually, a serious issue was that the exquisite environment that companies like Apple were providing you with were in a real sense off the web. And the question was, how could you get out of that walled garden? Walled gardens was what the world was like before the web was developed. If you remember systems like AOL, you were locked in a particular content provider with a particular set of standards. So we are very keen in the web world to try and promote open platforms. And the final feature here is open data. And this is what I want to talk a little bit about now, is why this data, whilst it will both have a set of challenges for us, has such rich opportunity. So here's perhaps an obvious-looking site. It appears to be perhaps light pollution, the kind of thing you might see from a satellite orbiting above Europe. Actually, what that is, every piece of luminescence, every pixel that's lit up there, is a upload of a flicker photograph that somebody has taken with a geocode. So when you take photos on your digital phone and you use the photo sharing site Flickr, you upload your data, it will know where it was taken. And the interesting thing about that is people don't take photographs in random, arbitrary places, of course. Squint your eyes a little bit and you will see there the map of London. You will see the River Thames, you'll see the major bridges and thoroughfares across it. That is the negative of the previous photo zoomed in on, a data set zoomed in on. So those are geocodes for Flickr's photos in London. And the good thing you do when you provide a Flickr photograph is you'll often tag it with what it was and where it was. I can take data directly, openly available from that mass scale, and I can see structure. I don't only see structure, I see where most people are most of the time. I can actually tell you what the 20 most popular tourist sites are because everybody's tagged them that way. I can begin to do all sorts of analysis that was, in a sense, never intended in the original data, but the ubiquity and scale of it gives me insight. So an open web can give emergent insight. An open web can also give emergent content. We're familiar with Wikipedia. People argue about how good the articles are. Actually, the core of those articles are extremely good, and it's transformed the world of encyclopedic information. And it grows all the time. I took this about 18 months ago, and there were 3.42 million English articles. Just a few months later, there were 4.2 million English articles. This is a collective endeavor to build organized, high-fidelity content across the piece, emergent content. So at scale, people contribute. Now, this isn't just data. There is data in there, very interesting sorts of data about who's adding the articles, what the changes are that are being made, PhD theses around this whole issue of why do people do this, what can we tell, emerge. But the open architecture and all the data can be downloaded about the history of involvement, engagement of this project available. Another one of my favorites is the well-known citizen science examples. This is Chris Lintart's group at Oxford who have built Zooniverse. This lovely example was built to help astronomers classify galaxies, simply because humans can do this great job of recognizing a shape much better than a computer. You can be trained to recognize a particular kind of shape very quickly, and people will go through, and have done collectively, millions and millions of these images. And they have now got insights that they would never had before, the scientists. The other interesting thing is that sub-communities of citizen scientists get their names on papers, make discoveries, get involved and engaged with the subject area. A really interesting feature. The other area where we get emergence on the open web is an interesting one. It's when people understand the shape and structure of the web so well that they can find stuff on it really well. And Page and Bryn here, our friends at Google, had the audacity to understand how you could take the matrix of the web's pages, billion by billion rows and columns, and find the pages that were most important in terms of the links in there that were most linked to by the other most important linked papers, and so on, all the way down recursively. That piece of engineering, of course, has made them a fortune and created one of the world's biggest corporations. Actually, they had to understand how to monetize the value of doing that search, but so there was an additional piece of work in there, and how to do the engineering to build the networks could actually do this work. And they now consume a significant proportion of California's energy each year, running the server farms to do it. But they built this on all the links that you and I put into the world's web pages at our own cost. So they have benefited and harvested this extraordinary open data product to build one of the world's great search engines. Not the only one. Baidu, the equivalent in China, extraordinarily powerful too. The thing I want to touch on now, though, is this whole issue of open data and why it's important. Just to say, this is, and since Tim Berners-Lee and I have been working on this with the UK government since 2009, with different governments actually, it's about non-personal data made freely and openly available. Now, this may sound like no great shakes, and it shouldn't be really. It's hard to imagine that just a few years ago, your postcode was a piece of data you had to pay the Ordnance Survey to use, okay? Or that the location of the country's bus stops was in some sense a national secret, and you couldn't find out where they all were. We finally got that one published. Interestingly, when we got it published, we found that the 360,000 bus stops in the United Kingdom, well, 17,000 of them weren't where the government thought they were. Okay. So actually, releasing data also has this benefit that people look at it and say, it's not that good, we can get it better, we can improve it. You can put crowdsourcing into that. The UK has been working in this area for a number of years. We're now, by many accounts, world leading in this area. And it's used in many contexts, some of them challenging. An interesting example is a site from Public Health England, which lists the 4 main killers in England by category and shows you essentially how well your regional council, your area, your local authority is doing. And there is a big variation. And people may say, well, no great surprise that poor old Manchester is 150th out of 150. You're on average losing 2.5 years of your life to somebody living in leafy Richmond. But even if you then factor out equivalent socio-demographics, so take 15 local authorities like York, there's a clear league table. Okay, some things much worse than others. Why is that? The data behind this is openly available. It holds people accountable. It makes people ask questions. There's a whole set of public health issues around that. But the availability of the data at scale and the way that people can interrogate becomes very important. Another good example here is the Lambeth Council in London, which releases data on childhood obesity. Terrifying set of data on how obese our 14-year-old children are across particular wards in a particular area. And the reason they do this is to actually draw people's attention to an incipient health crisis. And then ask the question, of course, is how do you do that? Now, the data, in a sense, is sitting there to be interpreted, and the real issue for responsibility is how you engage in that dialogue of interpretation. That one, of course, is death rates in our hospitals. This is actually available from an organisation called Dr. Foster. That has stirred no end of dispute and debate, as you can imagine. It's the kind of thing you would like to know. It's an interesting fact that you are more or less likely to die at the weekend in a particular hospital than another. It seems material. It seems it should be obviously open for scrutiny and discussion. But there are, even in examples like this, challenges about how responsibly data should be presented, debated, and discussed and acted on. Here's another one. We persuaded the local all the constabularies in England and Wales to release their reported crime data every month. We were told the sky would fall in, house prices would collapse. None of this happened. It's the most popular site that's ever been launched. It melted immediately when the millions of people typed in their postcode to see what was happening. The data was pretty, in some areas, suspect. It got cleaned up too. The issue about how we use this is used by a whole range of organizations, from the police themselves for kind of insight, rather better than a lot of their police IT systems, because other people write the apps that run on their iPhones that they can use. But it's also used by community policing groups, by action groups, to try and draw attention to issues and problems in an area, but not without issues. We don't show the location of every crime type on there. Domestic violence is not located on that map. You know, there are clearly issues of how and what, and the conversations we had with the Information Commissioner's Office were very much around this idea of a variable privacy tariff, that not all data can be treated in the same way in this context. And as we move on, we begin to see that that we're seeing the emergence of a national information infrastructure that is largely, it's essentially about non-personal data. But as in all these things, as you get more and more information, you have what's called this mosaic effect, that you begin to become, as already the credit agencies do, they tag you, you're mosaicked. You come from a postcode, you're assumed to read a particular paper, have a particular lifestyle, own a particular kind of car, vote in a certain way. The patterns that I started this talk with are everywhere now, and even in our open data work. But we have to be mindful of how this data is being used. And the place where we try and do that is at the Open Data Institute, which is based in Shoreditch here in London. We now have about 30 full-time employees, about 10 startups we're incubating, about 35 associates, and about 100 other people who are working with us, 30 corporate organizations who are members and working with us, funding from the World Bank, from the Media Foundation. This is an idea that's attracted huge attention, and the fundamental premise is that we try and build the demand side for open data. What can you do with the data that government's releasing? Can you build economic value, environmental insight, social capital out of this data? And here's one that is interesting. It's quite widely reported. It's a good example of the kind of work we're doing with big data in the UK. Again, this is NHS England. This is data on GPs' prescription habits. Interestingly, whether all of you know this, probably many don't, every month, every GP in England has to submit the prescriptions they have written out as open data. Not to who, but what the drug was and how much. That is an extraordinary resource. It's an extraordinary resource because we can build these kinds of maps. This is a map on the amount of expensive licensed statin that was being prescribed in a particular period in the NHS England as against the licensed, cheaper, much cheaper version. Huge variations in the amount of proportions. About £200 million in a particular year could have been sold in prescribing had the cheaper version been prescribed. And we've factored in the side effects and the special reasons, all the other arguments. Can we use that kind of analysis to change policy, to re-incentivize? There are many, the data doesn't tell you why this is happening, but it's absolutely telling you it's happening. This isn't a model, this is all the data. In the same way, interestingly, and that was a startup company that now moved on and are growing, we're happy to say, fast, doing this kind of analysis on big data assets, small startup. This is a small startup, but very noisy and valuable. Chris Taggart's Open Corporates. This is a wonderful site, by the way, if you have a look at it. You may wonder what you're looking at here. You're actually looking at data on beneficial ownership. Who owns who? And this is, Chris released data openly on the big 5 American banks. Who owned who? And these are very complex chains of ownership. When the financial meltdown occurred, it was a material question because people weren't quite sure who owed who what, because what entity owned what entity was a very, very material consideration. This data should routinely be available and open, well, for one very good reason, corporate accountability and transparency. And it's interesting to note, and there was some reluctance for papers to run this story in the US, but this is an interesting one. This is Goldman Sachs, and each area landmass is represented by the amount of subsidiaries domiciled in that area. You might wonder what that massive landmass is off of the United States, off Florida. That's the Cayman Islands, okay? So you begin to see, and there's Mauritius and Liechtenstein or Ireland and the Channel Islands and so on. Now, it's maybe no big surprise that big corporates use various sorts of institution and jurisdiction for tax efficiency and the rest of it. But it's a really material question when we're trying to answer questions around corporate and tax transparency. We've also done work on peer-to-peer lending. This is all the data aggregated beyond the individual to look at who lends to who in the peer-to-peer lending world in the United Kingdom. Very interesting data. It actually shows that there's a systemic failure of our high street banks because everybody is borrowing about the same amount across the country. Okay, it's just that the primary lender out is the southeast region, but everybody's borrowing about the same. This is a policy tool we built to engage with Londoners around fire station closures. It models what happens to response times if you were to switch off particular fire stations. And this was built in response to the Mayor of London's consultation and decision to close certain fire stations. In the end, the kind of policy model, the policy tool here showed that actually the decisions taken were quite sane. Like, you couldn't take the decisions and say the data showed otherwise, at least in this regard. Now, there are significant challenges around data. I could talk about data quality, which we know is variable and a bit iffy. I could talk to you about data curation. What are we going to do with all this data in the longer term? Do we have a duty of care over it? How do we make sure it doesn't rot on the devices and drives of the time? The ones I want to talk about just and close out are literacy. The huge challenge in an age of ubiquitous data is to educate ourselves and our children and our workforce and our colleagues and friends and our policymakers and political masters and mistresses on the issue of what's information telling you. I mean, really, really interestingly, we've always known that papers will take the same data and spin it, and that's all about testing the assumptions, understanding what a fair distribution or a reasonable sample is, asking questions about the deficiencies and quality of the data. Whose is it? What's its provenance? Where did it come from? Literacy, not just around IT, not just around being able to program, but to understand information in the information age will be crucial. There are issues around security, of course there are. But whenever I'm told that you can't release this piece of data because it is fundamentally going to reveal things that the bad people can use, I point to examples like the AIS system. This is the real-time position data that the shipping world emits routinely as open data. The position, speed, location, direction, heading of every ship over a certain tonnage. You can't get insured on the high seas without this data. Increasingly available now on leisure yachts and the whole thing. It was originally built to settle conflicts around insurance claims, to be sure that captains have been duly diligent and the rest of it. Somebody built an app for the Horn of Africa to kind of help Somali pirates find, There is always a reverse side to using this data, but on average, the upside enormously outweighs subversion and recruitment of the data for other reasons. The one, of course, that one's always asked about is privacy, bulk collection of data, the conditions and norms under which that should happen. And here, if there needs to be a single debate at scale, it should be on this question of what the permissible boundaries and use of data at scale are. And the European Commission is asking this question around the notion of the new European data legislation. The Obama administration commissioned a report on the NSA collection of bulk data. The President commissioned this report. It's reported, it's a very fine report actually. I commend you to read it, because it's about putting at the center of your technological capability very high-minded principles about preserving liberty, freedom, and privacy in this context. And that with all of the technological advances, we should always hold ourselves accountable to what is being done and how that data is being collected. So the debate, the questions around this, very material. And I'll finish on a note of optimism. I think that the web and data on the web, whilst there are huge challenges, and particularly in the space of personal data, we do see a space where data can be recruited for one fundamental purpose. With open licenses, using those open standards I talked about that make the web work, you can get large-scale participation. You can get open innovation. And if I believe one thing, it's that the problems in the world that we face will require the combined cerebral efforts, not of just a few people in the elite, but of everyone. This is why those citizen science astronomers and natural scientists and bird counters and seafloor watchers are important. But it's also the thing that enables somebody like Jack Andraka to come up with a few cent cheap paper sensor for forms of cancer, using the information, a high school kid, using the information, disrupting established medical technology. And it's why we need to keep the web open. Tim's claim to us was that actually an open and royalty-free standards that are easy to use, allow the web to be rich. His ambition is that this technological infrastructure serves humanity, and it's that we build it now so that those who come later will be able to create the things that we can't imagine. That's his injunction. And again, I can't do better than, in a certain sense, to call back to the original ideas here of Niels Bohr. If we make openness core, and this is openness about the way we think and talk about our technology, we can actually help move things forward. So I'm a hugely endorsing of the Responsible Research and Innovation Program, and thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nigel, for this really interesting talk, and I think the questions have shown that this is an area that people interested in responsible innovation really have to engage with. So I'd like to thank you again before we move on.
Thanks.